Okay, welcome again to the flowering of the Middle Ages. Could we maybe look at the slate here, the flowering of the Middle Ages, History 4330, and this is week 5. I want to clear up a little bit of a difficulty that some of the KUHT students have been having. Your papers are due on the week that I broadcast the session in which that week is. In other words, your papers are due on week 4 when you watch week 4. Your second paper is due on week 10 when you watch week 10. So when you see this sign at the beginning of the class, you know what week you are in. The studio class has different due dates than the KUHT class. So just to clear that up in case any of you have any problem, if you have any more questions, please email me. Okay, we turned in our papers last week, all of you, whatever week it is now. Last week was the week you turned in your papers. And so we're starting section 2. We're starting part 2 of the class, and we have a new paper assignment. Okay, the second paper is called Hands-on Experiences, and so what you are going to do is to go out in the community and see various things that have to do with the Middle Ages. You need to choose 3 of the following options. You can go to museums, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston or the Menil Collection, and both of those are in Montrose. You can visit them on your own, or you can go on a tour with me and see the syllabus for the time of that tour. On our website, the WebCT site, there is a site called Guidelines for the Second Paper, and I have all the addresses and phone numbers of the museums there. Another option you have is to see the medieval manuscripts in the UH library, and these are real medieval manuscripts that you can go in and you can see. Pat Bozeman makes you put on cotton gloves to touch them, but you get to actually look at them and turn the pages and look at the manuscripts. This is in special collections on the 7th floor. However, she only permits you to see 1 manuscript per visit. So I encourage you to go back per day, actually. So I encourage you to go back for at least 2 days to see the manuscripts. They're open from 8 to 5 Monday through Friday and 5 to 7 on Wednesday night. And here is a sample. This is a photograph of one of the museums, one of the manuscripts in our collection, and I think I have a second one here. Yes, here's another manuscript, another photograph of those manuscripts. So you get to really, this is a different manuscript than the one I just showed you. So you get to see real medieval manuscripts. Okay, other options. You can go to the Renaissance Festival. Now, I'm a little leery about this, but if you're very careful and you're very careful to see your lectures first and measure up the Renaissance Festival with what you know about the Middle Ages, and you have to be very discerning to figure out what is authentic about the costumes and the singing and dancing and the acting, and you can compare it to our lectures. Another option, and this is a free option, unlike the Renaissance Festival, another option is to visit churches, especially downtown. And there's a list of churches, again, on our website on the guidelines for the second paper. There are names and addresses of churches that appear to me to have medieval elements to them. So look for architectural elements inside and outside. Look at stained glass. Another option is to attend a Latin Mass with Gregorian chant, and I have found 2 churches in town that actually do the Latin Mass still and do Gregorian chant, and it's kind of like going to a church in the Middle Ages. And compare that to the music lecture, which we're going to have tonight. And here are some of the churches that you might see. This is Holy Rosary Church, and they have a Latin Mass with Gregorian chant at Holy Rosary. That's the exterior. And here's the interior, and we'll look at it again in a couple of weeks when we have the architecture lecture. Here is Christ Church Cathedral also in downtown, and you can see the stained glass in the interior here that you might want to look at. See the WebCT page for guidelines for the second paper and helpful advice for writing this paper. Also, Patricia's going to put some comments on for the first papers on what you're doing well and what you're having problems with. There are also addresses of churches and museums and phone numbers. There's a new link to a website on helpful maps, and I have one of the students in this class to thank for sending me that, and it took me a long time to get it on there, but now it's there. So you have a link to some great maps. And there will be some notes on the architecture lecture, I hope by next week under course content. Well, last time we looked at the Vikings, Normans, and Crusaders and the medieval theater. And the connection between these two may not have been terribly clear to you all. So I see them as being linked together because the Vikings, the Normans, and Crusaders were breaking out of the boundaries of Europe and breaking out of old boundaries, creating new paradigms in government and in the arts. And we saw that in our lecture on the medieval theater, the new kinds of paradigms that were being created. Here are some Viking pictures. This is a ship. And this is a typical Viking stave church, and here is a Viking head that goes on the end of the boat. And here is the new breaking out of boundaries that we see with the Vikings and also with the Crusades here into the Holy Land. The Vikings and new governments were created in Iceland, Russia, Ireland, and Scotland and England as a response to the Vikings. The Normans were central in the making of feudal monarchy, and this eventually leads to the national state. And one key is that William the Conqueror brought reason, system, and order to the medieval state. He centralized the government in England, and he made it rational. He made it work in a very rational way, and it was the first unified state in Europe. The Crusades fostered internationalism, but the centers of exchange were really in Toledo in Spain and Palermo in Italy. And here is a king's court. It's actually the French king's court, but it symbolizes the English king's court. Here's the kind of punishment that brought order to England. You see these devils who are tormenting people. Here is a kind of new warfare, new technology for warfare that the Crusades brought back to Europe. And on the other side, the Crusades brought this kind of castle technology to the Holy Land. And here we have the Crusader states at the time of the Fourth Crusade, and this is the time when the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had replaced Byzantium temporarily. Okay, and Toledo is right smack in the middle of Spain, a center of translation, and Palermo is in Sicily right here as centers of translation between the Muslim world and Europe. This is a miracle play at Coventry, England, and you can see the wagon with the players on it as Tony Collins described it. Here is actual music from the time of the first miracle plays in the 10th century. And now we're going to turn tonight to medieval music. And here are some musicians, and let's turn to our slate. Please join in the group readings and responsive singing that we see, even if you're alone, unless you're in the library. Okay, I'm turning to John Snyder.
How many of you have heard medieval music? A few hands up. That's good. What kind of music do you associate with the Middle Ages? Gregorian chant has been mentioned, and there's been a recent recording which has been very popular, reviving that in everybody's consciousness. How many people have heard Gregorian chant live? It's no longer so common now that the Roman Catholic liturgy is in the vernacular. So it has disappeared from an everyday or almost everyday kind of event, and so now a recording of it has a chance of being news and becoming popular. That is part of what we're going to spend our time with this evening. But it would be a mistake, of course, to think that people heard nothing else in the Middle Ages because they had their secular music along with their sacred music, just as we do today. Things have not changed that much. And before we can really talk about the music of the church, well, as you probably have already discovered, before you can begin one topic, you have to master two others. It seems like that anyway. And so we're going to have to talk a little bit about the way the Roman Catholic liturgy and services operated in the Middle Ages. And before we can really talk about that, we have to talk about calendars. Everyone knows, I think, when Christmas is. But who can tell me when Easter is going to be next year? And why should that be such a problem? But why? Why should it be inconstant when we know when Christmas is? This is an interesting question, if you think about it. Furthermore, because of the way they dated things in the Middle Ages, in their chronicles, in their records, in their writings, they refer to these dates in the Christian year as landmarks, as if everybody knew exactly when that was. And of course, we can calculate the date of Easter for any given year, but it does make things just a little bit strange when you say that they figured their year from Easter to begin with Easter every year, not necessarily with January 1st. They thought of the years beginning with Easter, the season of renewal. And so they also dated things in terms of the reign of whoever the reigning monarch was. So in the first year of the reign of so-and-so, and then think about it for a minute. When does that start? If he was crowned sometime in the fall, what constitutes the first year? Do they pick that up then with the following Easter? That is why when you're reading some of your history texts, you may find the dates given with 2 years separated by a slash. It's because it's not completely certain how we should unravel all of this and come up with a precise year. Because they dated these things often in terms of things that were almost circular in their references to each other, and it gets hard for us to know exactly where to put them on the kind of precise scale that we've come to prefer. But that doesn't get us any closer to the answer of why we don't know the date of Easter off the top of our heads. Does anyone know how to calculate the date of Easter? The rule is?
It's the first Sunday after the first full moon in spring.
Yes, after the vernal equinox, yes. Very good. That's the first time since we've been doing this that somebody actually knew right off how to calculate the date of Easter. What kind of calendar is involved here? An interesting kind of calendar that takes track of not only the equinoxes, but the phases of the moon. This is, in fact, the Hebrew calendar, which is a lunar calendar, but it's not a strict lunar calendar. The Islamic calendar, actually, is a strict lunar calendar. A month, it goes from new moon to new moon, and 12 months are a year. There are 13 more or less full moons in a solar year, what we in the West think of as a year. So the Islamic calendar and the Western calendars are gradually getting further and further apart in numbers, or actually closer and closer together, since they're catching up with this at this point, in terms of the year, the number that they give their year. So that when they have counted off 13 years, we've only counted off about 12 solar years. The Hebrew calendar is lunar to a degree, but every few years it is adjusted so that the months are more or less associated with a season, so that Yom Kippur always falls in the fall, the autumn of the solar year, right? That season. Whereas the month of Ramadan on the Islamic calendar can occur at any season of the year, and over a course of time it does. The Roman calendar, on the other hand, was, so far as they could make it with their astronomical abilities at the time, a solar calendar. They were much more attuned to having the equinoxes fall on particular dates, like March 21st, and when it started getting out of whack a couple of days, then the priest, the high priest in Rome, would simply add or subtract the necessary number of days in February and make it come out, and we still do that actually. February is still the variable month to make up the fact that the solar year doesn't come out in any particularly even way in terms of numbers of days or weeks or anything like that. So what happens is that the Christianity comes out of Judaism, and remember that that Easter is associated very specifically with the Feast of the Passover. So Easter would not be nearly so movable as it seems to us now in the West if we had remained on the Hebrew calendar. Whereas many of the other feasts were assigned fixed dates on the Roman calendar. So we have these two different calendars operating on different principles, with one of them sliding back and forth with respect to the other one as the years go by and adjustments need to be made. They don't go completely through a 360-degree cycle because the Hebrew calendar did have some adjustments to keep the months within basic boundaries in the seasons. Now then, in the course of the liturgical year, the Church Fathers wanted to organize things so that there would be a definite cycle to the seasons. And if you look there in your packet, in your little booklet, I think that's right on page 1, the liturgical year. And the way that works, basically, is that there's a big build-up for the Christmas season, and then that is followed by a prolongation afterwards until we begin the next big event of the year, which is Easter. And so that we alternate between those two poles, the coming of Christ and then the fulfillment of his mission. And this gives a chance for the for all those who are participating in the church services to get their basic church education renewed every year as the cycle comes around. And in fact, what the Church Fathers eventually did was to assign particular readings from the Scriptures for every day of the year. Some of them might be constant for a week or for an entire season, but others would change with the actual day. This means that they had a very elaborate organization for doing all of this, and it does mean that everything did get heard. And if you think of this coming out of the Hebraic tradition of reading the Torah on 1 or 3 year cycles, depending on the tradition, and then having the ceremony for rewinding the scrolls, of course, that is, I think, one of the many contacts that the Christian tradition has with Judaism. And this yearly cycle is an important thing that the Church Fathers invented. You have to remember several things. One is that almost nobody could read the Scriptures in Europe for much of the Middle Ages. As Dr. Von has pointed out, a great deal of the learning was concentrated in the monasteries and the monastic schools. The average person out there on the manor didn't go to school at the age of 6 and learn to read. And even for those people who could read, access was limited. Everyone, if they would think about it for one moment, would realize, of course, that Brother Dominic couldn't contact his friend at Xerox and have 500 copies of some manuscript made. Now then, let's take a little closer look at the liturgical year. There are some familiar things in all of this. One of them is Advent, beginning the fourth Sunday before Christmas. And then, of course, the events associated with Christmas itself and the week after. And then there will be 1 to 6 Sundays after Epiphany, because here we come to one of those places where we have to have a little give in the system, because the next cycle isn't on the Roman calendar, it's on the Hebrew calendar, really, and so we have to have this elastic place in the year where we can make the transition. Lent, of course, is starts the 40 days before Lent, but there's even before that they mark the Sundays that fall within the 70 days, 60 days, and 50 days. Septuagesima Sunday is actually was an important service in the Middle Ages. I don't know how closely it is observed these days, but in the Middle Ages, they telegraphed the beginning of Lent 3 weeks ahead of time. Lent was taken very seriously, and was actually well into modern times. Theatrical performances, even in the 18th century, were normally banned during Lent. You couldn't have opera, for example, so it's affected music in a lot of ways. And then, of course, from Ash Wednesday through the events leading immediately up to Easter are fairly familiar. Following, there are several events that sort of prolong the spirit of Easter. Easter Sunday, and then there will be several Sundays after Easter leading to Ascension, and then Pentecost, the 7th week after Easter. It's named for 50 days. We multiply 7 times 7 and get 49, but they counted differently and got 50, and we'll come back to that. And then even after that, then there are some feasts that were introduced actually in the time that we're talking about, in the 13th and 14th centuries. Trinity Sunday and the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is the Thursday after Trinity Sunday. Again, the habit of dating things in terms of church feasts, even if they happen to be movable ones, continues until fairly modern times, because there's a city in this state named for and a bay named for the fact that the place was discovered by the Spanish. The Indians were there a long time before, but the Spanish came across it on what happened to be Corpus Christi of that year, the Feast of Corpus Christi. And then, again, we have to have a little slack in the system before we start the next cycle with Advent, and so there will be anywhere from 24 to 28 Sundays after Pentecost. And in the manuscript books, they are simply numbered by the number of the Sunday after Pentecost. And then it begins again. Now then, this is what's known as the temporale, the proper of the time. These are all proper events, and each of them will have its own particular set of readings. Obviously, the time to read the Christmas story from St. Luke would be Christmas, not at Easter. So these things are done fairly logically. Right? If you turn the page, then we have another list, and I have not put in here anywhere near all of it. It's continued to grow, actually, of course, since the Middle Ages. But this would be the proper of the saints, known as the Sanctorale. I've started it with December because that is how it often starts in medieval manuscript books. In the modern books, they just start with January 1st, as one would expect. And I've included a few of the famous ones and a couple of the less famous ones for various reasons. If you might look some of them up, and then you would find out why I included them on this list. I think I got most of the apostles in. But you will see that some of these celebrate actual named saints, like St. Patrick on March 17th. Everybody knows that one. Some of them celebrate events more than anything else. Many of the Marian feasts, the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary on December 8th and so on, are more events than particular persons, the Annunciation and so on. They're all associated with Holy Innocents there on December 28th is associated not with named individuals, but with, obviously, a large number of persons whose names are not preserved. A few of the medieval ones of interest to us here are St. Thomas of Canterbury on December 29th. That's Thomas of Becket. For those of you who saw the movie, yes. And Gregory I on March 12th, an interesting person. And of course, St. Augustine has been mentioned on August 28th. St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th. And All Saints' Day on November 1st, of course, is still quite well known. Mostly known for the vigil, the night before, as Halloween, the eventide before, the evening before, All Saints' Day. Many of these are now obscure. St. Bede on May 27th, I don't think is widely celebrated in this country. And in England, maybe he is still given some notice. But in fact, local saints have always had a place in the church. And so when you have a service book from any particular church, it will often have, besides the list of the usual ones, there'll be some local saints marked in. And we'll have a chance to look at a calendar from not quite the Middle Ages, but from the 15th century, from France. This is a church at Reims. And there are some features of this that you would find very interesting. First of all, it says October. And it says it has 31 days and 29 La Lune, it says, refers to the nights. How they get fewer nights than days like that, I don't know, but that is what it claims to say in French. On the first of the month, St. Remigius, who is written there in French. And then on the second, there St. Leger, St. Patrick on the third, St. Francis, not sure which St. Francis, on the fourth, St. Christian on the, a woman, on the fifth, on the sixth, I'm not sure how to read that abbreviation from the French, and St. Benedict on the 7th. What you don't see are dates that you would really like to have, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What you do see here is something that says the nones, and further down it would have the ides. This slate, they are still using Roman dates. Yes, tradition. And the way the Romans dated was to count backwards towards these landmarks in each month. The first day of the month was the kalends, from which we get calendar. And then, of course, the nones and the ides. And you simply counted backwards, counted down to those. So after the ides in about the middle of the month, and it was a long countdown to the next kalends. How the Romans, a very organized sort of people, ever came up with this particular way of keeping track of time, I have never understood. And it's worse than that, of course, because you will see that the day before the nones is marked with a 2, and the 2 days before is marked with a 3. They count both end points because Roman numerals didn't have a 0. When we think of measuring space, we think of a ruler, and even if it's not explicitly marked, the end of it is 0. 1 is an inch in, or centimeter, or whatever it happens to be these days. But the Romans counted both ends, which is why Pentecost is the 50 days. They count Easter Sunday also. Yes, that is not the 0th day. That is day 1, and day 50 turns out to be Pentecost. This is fairly useful information if you have to sort out a date from a medieval description. There's a certain amount of calculation involved, and there's also a certain amount of looking things up to find out when the nones falls in any given month, or the ides, because it's not always on the 9th and the 15th. In October, it's the 7th and the 13th, and you just have to know how that goes in those months. And I only know when I've looked it up for a particular month. That's not something, I'm not a Roman, I don't carry that around in my head. Okay. So this is a little bit of an introduction into how the church year worked in the Middle Ages. One still finds references, I think particularly in England these days, but they will refer to Michaelmas as a date. It's in September. Is it the 29th? Do you remember? Like something along in there.
I thought Michaelmas was in November. Maybe
that late?
I'm wrong. I thought Michaelmas was
I
in
could be
November.
mistaken.
Yeah.
But we are not, obviously, we are no longer accustomed to dating things that way, except perhaps for Christmas, or maybe we sometimes date things in terms of Easter because families plan to get together then, but they look at their calendars and find out exactly when that's going to be. They were accustomed to referring to saints' days as ways of giving a date. Very accustomed to that. And we would never think, really, of dating a letter, even if we happened to be aware that it was St. Patrick's Day because we had forgotten to wear green and been pinched. If we were writing a letter to someone on that day, we would not say, in die nativitatis sancti patrici, whatever the genitive for Patrick would be. Yeah, it's not a Roman name, so I can't come up with a Latin for that. But we wouldn't think of dating things that way. We wouldn't think of dating December 31st by saying St. Sylvester's Day, although in German they will refer to New Year's Eve as Silvesterabend.
You know, and if I could inject a comment there about the kind of stuff I work with in the 11th century, and you might find a letter that will say, it'll be written to somebody and say, well, I'll meet you in Rouen the second Sunday after Michaelmas. And so they would kind of set their dates that way by these landmark dates, like Michaelmas was really important in England and Normandy. And so you have to know when all these days are if you want to figure out what day it is.
Okay, I saw a hand up back here.
Yes, I was wondering, was there a standard Bible text at this
Yes.
time?
St. Jerome's translation of the Bible, the Vulgate, which he did at the beginning of the 5th century. There had been an earlier Latin translation which was not complete, the Itala Bible, as early as the 2nd century, but the Vulgate of St. Jerome was standard. After Greek had ceased to be the lingua franca of the Mediterranean basin, at least the western part of it, then there was a need for a Latin Bible, and that is still the official Latin translation. And you can find it on the shelf in the library. You can find concordances to it, actually. There are complete concordances you can look up if you need to find out where a particular word occurs in the Bible and in a Latin word in the Latin translation. You can look that up. It's in print. It's readily available. Now then, let us take a little bit of a look, skip a page over to page 4 here. We've looked at the cycle for the year. Let's consider the day. How the religious day went. Day in and day out, by the way. Mass is not only on Sunday, there is a Mass every day of the year. It's not expected that everybody will attend all of those. Only the ones on Sunday are expected for everybody, and then on major feasts like Christmas and so on. Still, people who had the time or wanted to be particularly pious, felt particularly religious, did try to hear Mass as frequently as possible, and if they could, daily. But that's not the only service of the day. Every day, there is this thing called the divine office. And this occurred not only in monasteries, but in the churches. The secular clergy was expected to observe these also. Certainly this was not something that the populace attended, but this was something that the clergy carried on, right? On a daily basis, day in and day out. And so sometime after midnight, in the wee hours, there was Matins. At daybreak, there was Lauds. At the first hour, which is generally reckoned to be something like 6 a.m., although again, they're more attuned to nature than we are. They didn't have alarm clocks. So that in Northern Europe, the middle part of the day got squashed together a little bit as daybreak got to be later and later and sunset got to be earlier and earlier. In Norway, this would not be the same as it would be in Italy. At terce, the third hour, the name kind of says it all, about 9 o'clock. Sext, about noon, known about 3 in the afternoon. And those that have the numbers there are known as the little hours. There's not much of a service there. Don't stop for very long, otherwise they wouldn't be able to do the work that St. Benedict suggested might be equivalent to praying.
Could I ask a question
yes.
there? Then, do you think that calling 6 a.m. the first hour, which would be prime, would they name it that because it would be when the sun came up? Is that
yes.
the connection
yeah.
that we should have there?
Daybreak is dawn, is before actual sunrise, and prime is generally reckoned to be something like sunrise, about 6 a.m. And again, think of the biblical references. At the first hour, somebody went out and hired workers, and at the third hour, and so on. Yeah. Same way of reckoning the time of day, reckoning it from sunrise. And the 6th hour is noon, and in the winter, in Northern Europe, that's a much shorter 6 hours than it would be in the summer. But that's how they reckoned it. You know, the sky is a clock, and they looked at it. Yeah, right? They know from the position of the sun. Just at night, they would know from the position of the stars. That would vary with the season, also in a different way.
Well, that's really interesting because when I lived in England for a year, so I went through the whole cycle of the year, and I can just clearly remember how astonishing it was on December 21st, the winter solstice, the sun coming up at around 9 in the morning, and then I went out to get groceries that day, and I was coming home, getting on the bus from the supermarket, and it was 3 o'clock and the sun was going down.
Yes.
And that was the shortest day of the year in London, which is in the south of England. Think about that.
I had occasion to be in Edinburgh in late June, right about the opposite solstice. And in fact, it would have been easy enough to read a newspaper outdoors until about 10 o'clock at night, or then after 2 in the morning.
No wonder these people wanted to invent clocks, as John Lienhardt told us. They must have, especially in the north, it must have been very upsetting to have days that were 24 hours long in the winter and 6 hours long in the summer.
Yes.
24 hours long in the summer and 6 hours long in the winter.
0 hours long, and if you were far enough north in the winter. Yes. Okay. The evening service, their Vespers, is the only one of these that is probably at all familiar now. People still have Vesper services. If not on a regular basis, then at least occasionally somebody will organize a Vesper service. And in some denominations, it's a very regular kind of thing. And then Compline immediately before retiring, so that would be not long after dark, really. Early evening would be just when the sun's starting to head for the horizon. Again, candles are expensive. Just like electricity costs us money, and we're always trying to remember to turn the lights out. If you had to boil the tallow down and mold the candles and all that kind of stuff, you wouldn't burn them gratuitously. A votive candle is a real sacrifice. That cost real money at that time. And so to burn the midnight oil, to burn one's candle at both ends, those kinds of expressions reflect this sort of thing. Actually, in the Middle Ages, the service of Matins, at least in the monasteries, was a very important and fairly elaborate service. It was really, in some ways, the size, I think, of Vespers, and in the middle of the night. But it was. There were quite an amazing number of readings and musical items associated with that. Short ones, but it's not a trivial service at all. I suppose it makes sense if you're going to get up at that hour, you need to make it worth the trouble. It's the only explanation I can find for this. But the fact is that this daily cycle was also part of the rhythm of life in the religious life in the Middle Ages. And in an age before freeways and sirens and airplanes going overhead, I imagine that the sound of the monks singing could be heard for some distance. So I assume that it was part of the daily rhythm of life for everybody within earshot. Now then, the form of Vespers I've given here because it starts to introduce a few of the words that we might want to know about some things. The first thing is they always sing Deus in Adiutorium. It's a particular item in the repertoire. There are 5 psalms, and of course over the course of the year they get through all the psalms several times over. And each one is preceded, it has its antiphon, its framing piece, which is not a psalm. It's something that's drawn from the scriptures or paraphrased sometimes from the scriptures and set to music. And then, of course, the chapter they read from the scriptures. There may be a great responsory. We're going to sing a responsory. You weren't warned, but you're going to sing a responsory a little later. So we'll do a little of this if my voice holds up. And then some other things. The Magnificat, of course, it's actually a canticle. It's Mary at the Annunciation. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and so on in the King James translation. That is an important part of the service. More prayers and antiphons and commemoration of saints and so on. And then there'll be some closing short verses, including the Benedicamus Domino, let us bless the Lord. And that is the prescribed form of Vespers, and that then you can see that the particular psalms chosen and some of the other hymns and versicles will be chosen so they'd be appropriate for the season. And there are large manuscripts that give the whole cycle for the year, and those are called antiphoners or antiphonaries because they contain so many antiphons. Yes. Now then, if you'll just turn back one page, we'll talk a little bit about the form of the Mass, because that is the big service of the day, and for most people in the Middle Ages, of the week. This is the Mass as it came to be more or less gelled by the 11th century, and actually has not changed all that much since. For the rest of the Middle Ages would not have changed very much at all. There are some entrance ceremonies, what one of my sources refers to as fore-Mass. And you'll see that I have 2 columns there, ordinary and proper. The ordinary items are the things that would be common to every Mass throughout the year, with very few exceptions. Okay? The proper are those items where the content changes day to day, or at least season to season, around the liturgical year. So that the introit that one would sing for Christmas is not the same as what one would sing for Septuagesima Sunday, or for Easter, or for any other Sunday during the year. Kyrie and Gloria, however, are texts that are common to every Mass. Kyrie eleison, sung 3 times. Christe eleison, sung 3 times. And Kyrie eleison, sung 3 more times, meaning, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. And if it looks like Greek, it's because it's the only Greek left in the Mass. Very ancient chant, and very popular. There are some early accounts of it being done not in groups of 3s, but in 3 times 3, so that you actually have 9 statements. 3 times, 3 items each 3 times, and then the whole thing 3 times, so that you get this 9-fold supplication. Then there's a service of readings. You'll notice that I have indicated by the different typefaces there which are normally spoken and which are chanted to recitation tone formulas, and which are sung to things that we would think of as being melodies. You're going to get acquainted in just a few minutes with what all of that really sounds like. The sermon actually at this time was optional, but I don't know any minister now who thinks of it that way. That much, I think, has changed The credo, of course, and we'll hear a little of the credo. Credo in unum Deum, I believe in one God, the Nicene Creed. And then we get into the heart of the Mass, the sacrifice part of it. There are some offertory rites, and there is actually an item in the Mass called an offertory, which is proper. And eventually we get to the Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Israel, Dominus Deus Sabaoth, Holy, Holy, Holy. Some of these are very familiar texts to most people, although the Latin may not be anymore. The Lord's Prayer, of course, Agnus Dei, Lamb of God. There's a communion, which is proper. More prayers. There's a post-communion, very short chanted item there. And then finally, the Ita Missa Est, or Benedicamus Domino. Let us bless the Lord in the case of Benedicamus Domino. Ite Missa Est simply means go. This is the dismissal. This is the sending forth. And that word is where the Mass gets its name, Missa in Latin, and becomes Mass in English. So from just that one word in the dismissal, the whole service gets its name. Language at work.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Do you mean by free melody that they make it up as they go along, or does it follow a pattern?
No, it's a composed melody formula, and that's something that we will meet actually starting about now, I think. If you'll turn back over to page 4 and clear your throats a little bit, I'll teach you a little Gregorian chant. We'll sing it down a little bit. It's allergy season, and I don't want to sing it where it's written, and you may not either. You'll see that I have 2 lines of music written, and the top line is yours. And then alternately I sing the other line. I will be the leader in this, because I've practiced this, but I'll teach you the top part there. Has anybody here ever studied music, just out of curiosity? Oh, good. So we're going to find out something else about the Middle Ages right here. You'll have to learn this basically by listening carefully. Yes? We'll do this just a little bit at a time. First of all, since Latin is nobody's native language anymore, let's practice just thinking about how the text reads.
Before you start, John, could I ask everyone to press their mics when we all do this responding to you? Because now it's much better to be in a group than to respond singly. So everybody has to be responsible for pressing the mic on their table, okay?
It is true. Now, this is actually not terribly difficult. And there is safety in numbers. We have a good large group here. I'm not going to ask anybody to sing solo. No. Okay. Lumen ad revelationem. You all just sort of repeat there. Lumen ad revelationem. The accents are marked. Gentium.
Gentium.
Okay. Et gloriam plebis.
Et gloriam plebis.
Tuae Israel.
Tuae Israel.
Okay. One more time all the way through. Lumen ad revelationem gentium et gloria plebis tuae Israel. Okay. Think you can manage that? Notice that the G is soft, J, and the TIO also is softened, C, sionem. Rather Italianate pronunciation. Okay. Lumen ad revelationem gentium. Can you remember that? Sing. Press your mic buttons and sing. Ready? Yeah. Lumen ad revelationem gentium.
Wait, now before we go on, could I ask those of you off campus not to press your mics, because when you press your mics off campus, it switches off our mics on campus. So we'll have to have our choir in the studio for this.
I think that's probably how it's going to have to
But
be
you all
done.
in London and Aquitaine, do sing along with us. Okay?
Yes. All right. Shall we go on? Et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. It starts here, sing. Et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Okay, shall we try it all the way through once? Okay. You'll get plenty of practice because you get to sing it after every one of those other lines. There it's a refrain. This is the chorus for this song, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? So, from top, la sing, lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Not so bad. Let me give you a clue. What sings is not really your throat. It just feels that way. It's the diaphragm you have to support. So, right? If you feel yourself pushing against your belt, then you're beginning to do it right. Yes? Lighten up and just let it. It's easy for me to say. Now then, that is the antiphon, right? And I've given the translation below, beginning from Nunc Dimittis, which is the Canticle of Simeon. And the last line of it has been extracted and used as the refrain. And it's kind of a nice idea if you think about the way all this is put together. And then there are two more lines just stuck in here, and that's the doxology. Gloria Patri, Gloria Patri, glory be to the Father, and so on, which is inevitably put into recitations of this sort. In this case, the antiphon recurs after each line of the canticle. That isn't always the case. This is one of the few remaining examples of direct psalmody, as it's called, even though there actually isn't a psalm involved in it at all. It's called it's responsorial psalmody, and so that there's this responsory action between one person, the praecentor or the celebrant, and the schola, the little collection of monks or choir boys, novices, there forming the choir. Now, shall we try this? And the way it starts, of course, is with the... No, before we start, let me tell you exactly what's going on in the service here. This is actually before the Mass. This is something that's really not in anything quite. It's done before the Mass on February 2nd, which is the Purification of the Virgin. It's on the list of feasts that I have there on page 2. You can see what it is. And it's known as Candlemas because of the role that candles play in the ceremony. It's acquired that name. So there's another date that people might have referred to in the Middle Ages. Say, I'll meet you week after Candlemas. And they might very well say that. So now you know when it is. And since the candles play an important role in the service, then this reference to light, be a light unto the Gentiles and so on, seems like an appropriate bit of Scripture to extract and use for that service of blessing the candles before the Mass.
That's quite interesting because I started out talking about the schools, and this was a favorite kind of metaphor the monks would make when they would talk about an educated person. They would talk of him as a light to all the people.
Yes.
So,
and of course, this goes back to the scriptural basis, the don't put one's light under a basket. I mean, there's always that reference, and that's what's really almost implicit here in this also. So, shall we get ready to do our little bit before the service here?
Could you sing it through like one more time real fast so we can get the melody? I think it's kind of foreign to our ears. It sounds so different.
Yeah, we'll talk about why probably after that we've heard some of this after the break. Yes, it does sound a little different.
If you could sing it through another time so we can kind of hear it, maybe we can sing it better.
Okay. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Okay, shall we try it once? Take a breath. Press your mic buttons.
Press your mics.
Sing.
Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Okay. Nunc dimitte servum tuum, Domine, secundum verbum tuum in pace. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Quia viderunt oculi mei, salutare tuum. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Quod parasti ante facium omnium populorum, lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Lumen ad revelationem gentium, et gloriam plebis tuae Israel. Thank you. Yes?
Now, off campus, how did we sound? No comments. London.
That didn't sound too bad. I think we do it a little better, though.
What did he say? Oh, well, let's hear him. Let's hear him. They said they...
Okay. Now then, we're going to hear a little bit done by people who actually have voices, which I don't, and have practiced using them, which most of you probably haven't. If you look on page 38, I believe it is, you have the text for musical works, including some of the text for the Midnight Mass for Christmas. That's, I think, a service that needs no introduction. Many people have attended midnight services, masses, or Protestant services of one kind or another, and it's something that is still observed. And a glance at the texts, I think, makes it very clear just how carefully they are chosen for the occasion. The Lord said to me, "You are my son, this day have I begotten you." And then the Psalm verse, although the introit is actually drawn from the Psalms also, "Why have the nations raged and the people dwelt on foolishness?" Again, having to do with the coming of the Prince of Peace, then these two lines are contrasted with each other. It's something that everybody would want to think about at Christmas, and same kind of thing is used still as the subject for Christmas sermons and that kind of thing. Yes? Yes, that's correct. How much they would have understood, I can't say. The modern Romance languages had begun to depart from Latin by the 11th century, but we're still relatively close, and I think that people grew up with this and probably understood it reasonably well. In Germany, where the local language was not a Latin derivative, I can't say at all, or in England, I will say that traditionally, and I don't know that it's true, that by the later Middle Ages, the clergy in some places mispronounced Latin pretty badly, so that hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, from the Eucharist part of the Mass, was occasionally mispronounced so badly that the hoc est corpus part became hocus pocus. This whole idea of something mystical happening and being called hocus pocus supposedly derives from that. Now, the etymologists can argue over the legitimacy of that claim. I won't get into it, but the claim has been made. And there certainly were complaints about the incompetence of the clergy in some quarters.
But in the 11th century, now, Norman French, which I'm kind of familiar with, I mean, I don't read a lot of it. Most of the stuff I read is in Latin, but in looking at the Norman French, it is very, very close to Latin, much closer than it is to modern French. I would think that people could understand.
Yes. And even by the 14th century, the French had not acquired all the modern characteristics. The pronunciation was markedly different from what it is now. Fewer letters were dropped in pronunciation, and it would have sounded somewhat closer to Latin, and someone who heard them both regularly would be able to make the connections. Okay. Now, unfortunately, we do not have a time machine to take us back to the Middle Ages, but we do have a magic way of dropping in on the organ recital hall across campus, where we did in fact tape last Friday. Some members of our chamber singers, some of the men, were kind enough to give some of these pieces a reading for us. And one of the things that you'll probably want to notice will have to do with how many notes are being sung on any given syllable. Most of what you sang was one syllable per note. Occasionally, a syllable might last for 2 notes. But we'll see here on this one, you just have these 2 there on the screen. It lines up 1 note per syllable with 1 exception. And by the time we get here, we have several notes per syllable. And we'll talk about this a little bit further. These symbols, this is the Gregorian notation. It's the ancestor of our modern notation. But it looks a little different. It's actually more efficient in terms of space. And these shapes that might include 2 or 3 notes in one shape, there's one that takes 3 notes, but it's one shape. Those are called neumes. All right, and I have the word there so that you can spell it. It's this one. And so syllabic chants would be those that would have basically 1 note per syllable. And pneumatic would have several notes per syllable, a small number, 2, 3, 4, something like that on the average. And in fact, this is the introit for the Midnight Mass of Easter, Dominus Dixit ad me, filius meus est tu, and so on. I just have the first little bit of it there. And we will hear them singing that over in the organ hall. So if we could start that tape, please.
Yeah.
Sicut erat in principio, et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Dominus dixit ad me, filius meus est tu, ego
Yes, the acoustics there are very live in the organ hall, much like you would find in a stone building in the Middle Ages. And in fact, buildings like that are still used to record, not just because of the appropriateness of the location, but because of the acoustics. Very nice. Now then, we're going to go on and hear the next one, the gradual. The graduale there is so called because at this point the celebrant stands on the steps leading up into the altar area. Gradus is step in Latin, and so this is delivered from the steps, the solo parts of it. And you will notice again that there was a part for a soloist and response from the scola. And so you'll have a chance to notice here the relationship between the soloist and the chorus. And do try to listen for whether this is syllabic or pneumatic, or whether they go on and on and on and on, singing one syllable on many, many notes.
Oh, what is pneumatic? What do you mean by pneumatic?
Pneumatic is when there's about one neum per syllable, which might be, 2, 3, 4 notes on the average, something like that. That's the distinction that we just heard here with Dominus. Much of that was, 3 notes on a syllable frequently, about which you can fit into one of these symbols there, a neum. And I'll show us some non-machine written neumes after the break. So if we could hear the next item there, the gradual.
Tu
describe that as syllabic? No. Some of those syllables were stretched out over a good many notes, a couple dozen notes in a few cases. That goes beyond pneumatic. That brings us all the way to melismatic. And such an occurrence in music is referred to as a melisma, a place where there are many, many notes on one syllable. And it's not restricted to Gregorian chant. I can think of, what was it, the Beatles, one of their late hits, Let It Be. That last E in Let It Be went on for quite a few notes. That's a melisma. Right? Chants that are characterized by having a lot of melismas in them would be referred to as melismatic. Right? What we've been hearing is Gregorian chant. It's not the only chant of the Middle Ages, however, and actually the connection with Pope Gregory is a little mythical. But the fact is there were some regional chants. There was an Old Roman chant. There was a Frankish chant. There was a Mozarabic chant in Spain. And there was, and actually still is, an Ambrosian chant in Milan associated with the church there. And they've retained their independence. And they trace this back to St. Ambrose himself. Supposedly. And Ambrosian chant is famous for its melismas. There are some cases where there are 100 or even 200 notes on a syllable. A few, not many, but a few. There's nothing quite like that in the Gregorian repertoire. What we think of as the Gregorian repertoire actually is an outcome of the interest in education and unification of his domains shown by Charlemagne, who had service books brought from Rome and set about standardizing and organizing the literature throughout his realm. That leads to things that we'll want to take up just a little bit later. We have time at this point, and then we'll stop for a break, to hear not the next item, but if you'll turn the page, I've done this in a slightly different order for pedagogical purposes, the reading of the Christmas story, and we're not going to hear anywhere near all of it, for reasons that you'll understand as soon as we hear a little of it. Listen to what's going on, and then we'll talk about it for just a minute before break. That's the wrong piece. That's the credo. But we can hear that now, I guess. Why don't we? Credo melismatic? I think you heard basically about one syllable per note. A few places, 2 or 3. That is very much a syllabic chant. Why do you suppose it would not be melismatic? Yes, you have an answer?
Did the people sing with this?
No, the people didn't sing with this. But think of the length of the text involved. If you started stretching the credo out, they would be singing yet. Yes? Very long text must really not be set melismatically, and so then for shorter texts, feel they have more freedom, and that's been true in songwriting ever since, actually. Okay, I think at this point we should take our traditional mid-period break of what, 10 minutes?
Well, before we take a break, before we leave, I'd like to challenge the guys in London who think they can sing better than we do, and the guys in Aquitaine to practice while we're on break and sing just one response. We sang 4, and let's them try it. I found it quite hard to sing this music. And London, will you accept that challenge?
Okay, why not?
What did he say?
Why not?
Why not? Okay, great. 15 minutes. They need a lot of practice.